Hey there, this is Lonnie Teper, and welcome to another edition of Dig Deeper with Teper, where I bring you the story behind the story. Today, my very special guest is one of bodybuilding's living icons, John Balik. John, welcome to the show. I know you're in Florida now after being based in SoCal for many years.
Right. Moved here because of both of my children live here and weren't coming back to California, so I decided to move here.
Well, how do you like it so far? I know you've been there a couple of years.
Well, it's a totally different thing than Southern California. As you probably know, I lived within a mile or so of the beach for 50 years, so this is a totally different climate. It gets 80 at night and 90 during the day, and high humidity in the summer. It's a tropical climate, but everything is green. It's spectacularly green, and it's just a totally different thing. But I lived almost 60 years in Southern California, so as my wife would say, we probably got that out of our system.
Well, most people know you as a former publisher of Ironman magazine, but there's so much more to your background. Why don't we back up a little bit and see where it all started?
Well, it all started actually with an Ironman magazine. I was 14 years old. That's 1956. And I wasn't feeling well. And this is March of 56. And my mother, for whatever reason, went to a newsstand that was about a mile from us and bought a copy of Ironman magazine. Before that, as a little prelude to that, both of her brothers, both of my uncles, trained in the early 50s. And in fact, the first barbell set that I worked out on were on loan from my uncles. So that was the start, training in the basement with a friend of mine in an unheated garage at 30 degrees outside, in the wintertime. But it grew into obviously a lifelong obsession.
Now, I know you eventually went to college at Marquette University.
Right, right. Marquette University. I have a civil engineering degree. Right after I graduated, I moved to California in 1965 and was there most of the time until we left 3.5 years ago. In between, I trained at the New Central YMCA, which was downtown in Milwaukee, and there was just a lot of wonderful bodybuilders there. It was like the Gold's Gym of Milwaukee. And the former Mr. Wisconsin's and former Mr. Milwaukee's were there. So it was really a hotbed and I started to compete. I competed in weightlifting, the 3 Olympic lifts, in the 132-pound class. So I started out, I was still a teenager, but by the time I got to Milwaukee, I was a 150-pounder. And trained with a lot of very interesting guys there. Among them, Chet Yorton, believe it or not. Chet Yorton had already won everything in Wisconsin when I met him there. I went on, of course, to train at Gold's Gym in 1965 when Chet and I were both members. I moved to California basically because, number one, I had a very good job as an engineer. Number two, bodybuilding and the ocean, etc., had a strong pull on me. So I ended up being one of the first 40 members of Gold's Gym, the original Gold's Gym in 1965. And that was the beginning of a life story, you might say.
I know you're a big fan of the Muscle Beach shows. There's a particular reason why. That's you first stepped on stage, right?
That's one of the first times I stepped on stage, and these were very low key compared to today. There were maybe 8 or 10 people competing, and it was a very, very low key thing. But it was a lot of fun with Gene Mosé and the Wong brothers, and it was interesting.
You've had so many lives within your life. In this industry of bodybuilding, I don't know where to start. Why don't you take us from those days into where you became more involved?
Even before I moved to California, in the Chicago area where I lived, I met Bob Weider, and with Bob Weider, I met Sergio Oliva. So I met Sergio and Bob long before they were national and international contenders. So that was and I'll tell you one little funny story about Sergio. Sergio came out in 1965 in California, and he lived at my house for a couple of the weekend and a long weekend before the contest.
How did he fit?
Well, it's what was funny is brought he and Bob Weider in late at night from the airport, and he was standing in my kitchen at about 6:30 a.m. This is Sergio without a shirt on, and my son Roland, who you know well, walks into the kitchen and says, "Where are you from?" And with a very straight face, he said, "Africa." And it was one of those moments that were kind of indelible. But anyway, two wonderful guys that, especially Bob, had a lifelong friendship with Bob. And then in California, as I said, the Gold's Gym thing started, and I was working as an engineer and actually training at 5 o'clock at night at the end of the thing, and that kind of led to also being part. I moved to Hollywood, and I became a member of Vince's. So, kind of by accident, I'm a member of two of the most famous gyms. We didn't think they were famous at the time, of course. They were just gyms. And I got to know Vince very well, and in fact managed that gym on weekends for a couple of years. And that's actually where I met Arnold in 1968. Arnold walked through the front door, and you know that story. It's become, I'm not going to say legend, but it actually happened. Vince was sitting at his little front desk there. I was next to him, and Arnold walks in with a tank top, white shorts, and flip-flops, probably weighing 255. This was right after he lost to Zane in Florida, and probably the biggest he ever was. And he said to Vince, "I'm Arnold," with a very heavy accent, of course. I won't do that. He said, "I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger. I'm Mr. Universe." And Vince slowly took his unlit cigar out of his mouth and says, "You just look like a fat fuck to me." And I'm sitting there. Am I going to watch a fight, or what's going to happen? And how much did Arnold actually understand? Two things. He was. I think he got it, and that was the heaviest he ever was. It was a funny thing. Arnold has the ability to extract what's useful. He understood Vince's words, because he later told me that he started to understand what a quality physique was, because he was just interested in being as big as possible. And you never saw him at that body weight again. He was never 255. Probably 1974, he was 242. That was the heaviest that he ever was after that point. So Vince had being in Vince's gym was a special thing. Joe Gold, 1968, I started to expand my knowledge and interest in nutrition. And actually, I formulated the first Gold's protein, 1968, and so I learned about how that was all done. And of course, we used Rio Blair as a sample. That's what we were trying to emulate, because that was the best protein on the market in the middle and late 60s. So that takes me about to 1970 when let me see, 1967 or 66, I met Art Zeller. That was a complete turning point. He was, of course, a legendary photographer, and I started to show him some of my photos, and of course, I'll have to say he was a ruthless critic, but I learned from him. He was a guy that knew what he was talking about. Sometimes as a young photographer, it hurt to hear it, but I did learn. So, and through him, I met Joe Weider. So that was what I've seen, as in preparation for this. As you know, I tried to make kind of a timeline of the people I've met, because the people I've met are the people who actually formed my life. and my memories. In that same period, I trained at Bill Pearl's. I met Bill. So all of a sudden here, this guy from the Midwest who knew nobody knows Art Zeller, Joe Weider, Vince, Bill Pearl. That's at the time. Actually, I didn't think it was anything like, oh my God, what are these people? It was because the way they welcomed you. You were just a part of the group. You lifted a barbell. You cared about training. That's all we need to know.
John, was Pearl's gym in Pasadena at that time, or was it in Inglewood?
It was in Pasadena. I did in 1964. Actually, I did visit on a trip to California. The one in Inglewood. That's where I first met Bill, actually. But I was only out there for like a week.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of stars training at that Pasadena facility.
Yeah, it was like walking, knowing Bill only through the magazine and walking into that gym. It was like, here's Pat Casey bench pressing over in the corner. It was almost like a vignette. It was a sound stage, very theatrical feeling.
As much as Casey?
Pardon me?
As much as Casey?
Oh, he was a huge. He was a big guy at that point. He was the best bench presser in the world. But anyway, Bill welcomed my training partner and I, who I drove out on Route 66 with, 2,100 miles nonstop. And he welcomed us like he knew me for 20 years. So that I've known of all of the quote old timers, the people that are really the foundation of what we talk about today, the Bill Pearls, the Art Zellers, the Joe Weiders, Vince Gironda. Every one of these people were special. You didn't lift weights in the 40s and 50s if you were in the middle of the bell-shaped curve.
Well, I tell you one thing. You better have pretty thick skin to go into Vince's. Vince, I remember the first time I went in there, I walked out like I was stun gunned.
Well, Vince was. I would get in arguments with Vince about all kinds of things, and usually his final line to me is, "You're just a cement-headed Pollock." That was what he would tell me, but he's the kind of guy that would give you the shirt off his back. So he would be gruff. It was like you'd walk by him one day and he wouldn't notice you walked by, and the next day it's a warm thing. That's just who he was. He was a mercurial character, and people all say that, but you have to be around him enough to be able to absorb it and give it back to him, and then have the shine. He came out to, when we had the magazine, all the way up to being 80, he would come out to the office in Oxnard and sit and talk for hours with Steve and I. So it was a long range, 1966, I think, was the first I met him. So I knew him a long, long time, and he was a brilliant guy. He was way ahead of his time in many, many areas.
Tell us about the supplement company you got going.
Well, I think I alluded here to making a protein for Joe Gold. But basically, I made it so I'd have some for myself. And so I ended up finding a manufacturer that I felt comfortable with. And I then started a mail order business on the side, literally out of my garage. It was called Scientific Nutrition. And I tried to kind of emulate, Rio Blair would say copy, emulate what Rio Blair did as far as the line of supplements, with some things that he didn't do. And advertised in Ironman. So I used to get full page ads in Ironman in probably, around 1968. And that was the beginning of being really involved with the food supplement business, and making that a major focus. So that from there, Vince would buy all of the supplements from me, and I would private label it for him with his own label. I mean, the lab would do it. I wouldn't do it. But So that was a very interesting for me kind of sidetrack here, expanding my interest in nutrition, which really started with the Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, in 1962 or 3. And I read that in college, and it really made me think about the food supply and what we were doing to it. That was a book about DDT in the birds, in the predator birds. And that just got my interest going. And, you know, being in bodybuilding, I understood pretty early that nutrition was a major, major part of making any progress in this game.
So that's what held me back.
Say it again.
So that's what held me back.
Well,
my nutrition.
You know, this is what I say, you know, and the truth holds just as much today as it did 60 years ago. Anybody can improve. The champions are born because it's genetics in the final analysis. If you're running the 100 meters or if you're going on a bodybuilding stage, genetics rule at the top.
Yeah, I used to ask, a lot of bodybuilders used to ask me questions, how they could get to the top or be better than they are. And I had a real simple response: get new parents.
Well, if you read Arnold's Education of a Bodybuilder, the first thing he says is pick the right parents. And it's true. I mean, that doesn't mean, you know, that you can't be a lifelong trainer and enjoy it and get all the health benefits from it, etc. You're just not going to be quote, a bodybuilder in a competitive sense.
You're not going to be Arnold.
Well, you're not even, you know, without question. I mean, you know, we know, or Sergio Oliva, if you want to talk about even more gifted. You know, that's not going to, I mean, Sergio told me he squatted 500 when he was 15. You know,
I believe it.
You know, when I was 15, I was squatting the empty bar.
John, I was going to ask you one particular person that always fascinated me, because I met him when I was working at Cal State LA and he was a student there, was Frank Zane. Here's a guy walking around campus. He didn't even look like he lifted weights, really. And then when he got on that stage, he just exploded. What was the Zane experience for you in your years?
Well, I met him again through Gold's Gym. He eventually actually came to my house in Hollywood and bought supplements from me in 1968, 69. So I've known Frank from that period, and of course later on doing a lot of photo work with him. But Frank is the classic physique that when he's sitting next to you, dressed up in his sweat clothes, and this is true of Bob Guida also, that he just looks almost like a regular person. But when he begins to pose, it's changed. Everything changes. And also the same is true in reverse. There's bodybuilders that look like fantastic, and that they're going to be standing on stage, wide shoulders, narrow waists, etc., etc. They start to pose and they disappear. There's no contact about it. Muhammad Makawi, who is an unbelievable poser, compared to, I won't mention other names, but he was just a little guy. He mesmerized audiences. That's what's missing today, of course, is the posing.
You eventually started doing photography for the Weider magazines, where you met Mike Neveux,
right?
AKA Mike Neveux. How did that happen?
Well, believe it or not, 1964, Mr. America was in Chicago, and I actually photographed that. And fast forward, Art Zeller really was a catalyst here. For years, I didn't take any bodybuilding pictures at all. But being around Art, because Art would basically spend all day Saturday at Gold's. And that's why his pictures were so fantastic. He was the fly on the wall. Nothing was posed. Everything he took was as it was happening. And you felt that. But I didn't meet Mike until 1980. In between, I was traveling in, say, 74, 75, forward. I spent some time away from California. And when I did, if there was a local contest, New York or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, I would attend, take pictures, send Joe proof sheets, just as a freelancer, almost unsolicited. I would tell him what I'm doing, and he would go, go ahead and do it. And I started to get some pictures printed. And when I moved out to California the second time, when I got off the road and I moved back into Venice and got my photo studio, the world had completely changed in bodybuilding photography. Up to that point, other than Jimmy Caruso and Russ Warner, there weren't any dominant studio photographers. They were mostly natural light photographers, like Arte Zeller. So all of a sudden, I needed to have a studio. So I taught myself some studio photography, and through that, I met Mike, because both Mike and I were the photographers for Weider at the 1980 Mr. Olympia in Australia. So I spent, from not knowing Mike, and I realized very early that this was a guy in a class by himself. If you look at the work he did in high school and college, I mean, it was gallery stuff. And I learned a lot from Mike. Mike, like Art Zeller, didn't see me as being competitive in any way. They actually both became mentors. I learned from both of them. And not that I would ever think I could approach Mike Neveux, but it made me a better photographer. That's how I met Mike.
I met him too when I was writing for the Weider magazines, and particularly a magazine called Sports Fitness.
Right.
He would do most of the photography for that. But
yeah, well, he was a UPI guy. He shot football. Actually, the first time I saw Mike was at Mr. Universe contest that Jim Lorimer put on in Columbus. There was this guy that didn't have a press pass, and he had a lens about this long, long lens, and nobody shot long lenses. Nobody shot anything over a 105 because that's what the magazines printed. But this guy was circulating around with this long lens, taking pictures, and kind of went beyond me. Why would anybody do that? Of course, eventually I saw those pictures, and that was really the beginning when Joe Weider recognized Mike's talent right on. I mean, Joe would give me instructions on what he wants me to do. His instructions to Mike Neveux were always, just try something creative. That was it. Completely hands off. So Mike absolutely changed the way bodybuilding in the magazines looked. First off, money came into the magazine, so Joe could afford color photography. That was one thing. If you look at the magazines before 1980, they had almost no color because it was so expensive to do. But the magazine business exploded in the late 70s, early 80s, that Joe was able to use good paper and do a lot more color. So we ended up shooting contests in color. That was never done. Never.
What eventually led, years down the road to the purchase of Ironman magazine?
As I told you, my first touch with bodybuilding actually was Ironman magazine in 1956. 1967 or so, Perry and Mabel Rader were doing some national weightlifting contest in Los Angeles. And for some reason, I asked them, I would really be interested in buying your magazine. Now you're talking about somebody that was making, $700-800 a month in 1965. So it was a ludicrous thing to say, but they were very cordial, very nice. We talked for hours about bodybuilding and weightlifting, and they went back to Alliance, Nebraska, and about 1978 or so, I sent them some pictures, and they ran an Ironman magazine. And I started to talk to them about selling again. So I ended up in 1978 going with a lawyer friend of mine and an accountant to Alliance, Nebraska, and sitting down with Mabel and Perry and Mabel Rader to talk about the sale of a magazine. We left the table on Friday night, dinner. Everything was settled. This were the terms. This is what we were going to do, etc., etc. We were catching a plane at 5 o'clock in the morning the next day from Alliance, and Perry and Mabel drove us there. So we're in the car, and Mabel says to me, "You know, John, I couldn't sleep the whole night thinking about giving this up. I can't do it. I'm sorry." And that, we went from nothing was signed. It was a verbal at this, before this. So I said, okay. And, as my lawyer friend said, if this was somebody in New York and we're doing business there, we would be suing over this, but we're not doing anything here except walking away. Subsequently, I had conversations with them on the phone, and I said, will you just, when you do decide, I talk to them fairly often, when you do decide to sell, please give me a call. So 1984, Mabel calls me and says, I think we're ready to sell. That was a journey from 1967, 68 to 1984.
Did you think she was ever really going to call you? Or do you think it was
they're, what can I say? Very super honest people, et cetera, et cetera. I was never going to push them on anything. What happened was age. Perry got sick. Mabel, I think, went to 104.
Wow.
Yeah, she just passed away in the last couple of years here. Anyway, Perry got cancer. He was late 70s, I think, when he passed. But that was really what precipitated it was Perry and Perry getting ill. So that was the beginning of me trying to scramble to put together a group of people. Of course, Mike Neveux was number one on my list. And Mike goes, he wasn't happy with Joe because Joe tried to take possession of his photographs. Mike never had anybody, he never wanted anybody to own his copyright but him. So our relationship started with everything you take, Mike, is yours. And that's the way it is to this day. In other words, Ironman never owned anything that Mike Neveux shot. We use it, et cetera, but, with his permission. And he shot it specifically for Ironman, but anything in that archive is 100% owned by Mike. And I'm gathering, I think that you were probably the second person I hired.
We met at the Old World Gym on Main Street, and I was writing for the Weider magazines. Was very frustrated because I wasn't getting steady work. And you were in the gym, and Joe Gold said, John Balik, he just bought Ironman magazine. Go talk to him and see if you can get in from the bottom floor up. So I went and talked to him, said, I'd like to do contest coverage for you. I'd like to do the gossip column. I'd like to do featured stories. And you were leaving in 2 days for the women's nationals. This was 1986. And you said you already had somebody covering that show. And I said, well, that's okay. I could start with the men's nationals the following month. And lo and behold, then later that day, you called me and said, you want to go to Miami for the women's nationals. And just out of the blue, I was on a plane with you 48 hours later, my first show. And I had covered a show for the Weider magazine, a pro show that was held in Los Angeles, but I had never been to the national. That's what got the ball rolling with us.
Well, it just points to how my life has been shaped by serendipity. Meeting Mike Neveux through Weider, meeting you happenstance on a Saturday at World Gym. What's the odds of that? and not even knowing who you were. Anyway, my point is, I've been very, very fortunate to find and be surrounded by a wonderful cast of characters who made Ironman possible and made it better than anything else out there. In other words, your column, Lonnie, was never equaled by anybody, period. Ruth Silverman and her coverage of women's bodybuilding never equaled by anybody. In fact, she was the only woman, I think, covering women's bodybuilding, period.
Yeah.
She was a great writer, as you well know.
Well, John, going back a little bit, purchasing a magazine isn't like buying 2 tickets to the opera. You know, Joe Weider had multi-million-dollar supplement company to carry the load. And have that. I know there were probably a lot of sleepless nights when you were thinking about doing the deal, and after you made the deal, how this was going to become a reality.
Well, the big thing is I didn't know what I didn't know. It was a very steep learning curve. And when we took over the magazine, it was right at the crossroads of magazines being put up in the old way and magazines being put up on a computer screen. And the first 2 or 3 issues we did conventional, where the type is laid out and pasted down on the boards, etc. And we used actually a part-time art person to do it, and Mike did a lot of the layouts. He was very good at that, a lot of the layouts himself. And I concentrated on trying to get distribution, because Perry and Mabel Rader, they sold about 20,000 magazines a month, and it was almost all subscription. Just the opposite of Weider. Weider had 0 subscriptions because he didn't have a second class mailing permit. And he couldn't have a second class mailing permit because the USPS considered him a catalog. And in other words, they rate the magazine, quote, on how many advertised pages there are that are dedicated to the owner. So that was one of the things that we got as an asset from Perry and Mabel. Was we started off with a second class mailing permit, so we could then get subscribers. And then we got then I found out about national distribution. And then I met Warren Wanderer, who was a big time office sales for Weider out of New York. He called me out of the phone. I was selling the ads. And he calls me and says, you need somebody to sell ads. And he told me who he was. And I won't go into the story why he left Weider, but he ended up being another cornerstone. No salary, commission only. The first 6 or 8 months, he deferred his commission completely so we could get started. So again, out of the blue, I met somebody that I didn't know I couldn't exist without. It was scary.
Well, what a lot of people didn't realize, you talk about the huge Weider offices. And I remember going down after teaching at Cal State LA about 9 or 10 o'clock at night. I'd go into your studio at Venice and start helping with editing of the copy that was coming in. It was a very small operation.
No, we especially on weekends that we were shipping, I would literally go around the clock because of proofreading, and eventually put the boards on a plane to overnight ship them to the Midwest where it was printed. So it was, when you're younger, of course, the horizon is what you're looking at. I would be tired, but it didn't make any difference. But it was because of, again, Warren Wanderer, Mike Neveux, you, and it grew from there. We moved our offices from my photo studio into Marina Del Rey, and I'm sitting there at my desk, and a guy comes through the door and says, "I want to work for Ironman." I'm going like, "Okay, who are you?" And he goes, "Well, I just graduated from the University of Texas with a degree in journalism. My name's Steve Holman." That was it. I mean, Steve Holman was computer literate at a very high level, a tremendous writer, great editor, and a great organizer. I never had to ask Steve to do something twice. He understood it. I didn't have to give him detailed instructions because he knew what to do. And what I did over the years was, number one, the group of people that I was fortunate enough to be part of, I let them do their thing. I can't remember if I ever actually gave you an assignment. I don't think so. You created what you were going to do, who you were going to talk to, who you were going to interview, what was happening. Those are your ideas, not mine.
Well, in some of the cover stories, it was suggested by Steve.
Yeah, I would say maybe that. And again, it's the collaboration. It's a collaborative effort to get that magazine out. But in other words, and then Ruth Silverman didn't get the job she wanted at Flex, so she became a freelancer for us. So I've got you, I've got Mike Neveux, I've got Warren Wanderer, I got Ruth Silverman, and I've got Steve Holman. That became the nucleus for what we did, and we had no limits. These people. The traditional magazine people were very slow to move onto the digital world in the 80s. We had no boundaries. Steve, everybody learned how to do what they would do, and that took the typesetting and put it in our control, rather than out as a vendor. That changed everything again, but I couldn't do that. Weider took 3 or 4 years after me before they started to do what I did. And it's not because I did it out of necessity, and I had the right people.
Well, everybody did based on what we did. I remember after the 86 National, we were going back and that I'll have the story for you on Monday. And you said, no, you don't need to turn it in now. 2 or 3 months down the road is when they run. And I said, yeah, that's got to change. Because you got to beat the competition. You got to be the first guy out of the block. And we recreated the contest coverage immediately.
Right.
Which led to several other firsts that we started.
Well, we did a lot of things first along the way, simply because, as I said, it's the people, the combined vision, just what you just said there. And, I tried that, as you may remember, with my bodybuilding news, to try to get, I was the first one to actually get print out within weeks of an event. And I had a few thousand subscribers. It was, again, a labor of love. It was kind of a prelude to Ironman, and I learned a lot of stuff that I had to do to make it work. Again, with Mike Neveux, he was a key part of this thing. So anyway, that got us started. And really, it was. We were also in front of a wave. So the wave was building. So it was the way, as I say, we were running with the wind at our backs. I mean, in the 70s, Muscle and Fitness or Muscle Power was printing about 70,000. In 1987, they were printing 700,000. Pumping Iron, Gold's Gym, Joe Weider, that triumvirate in the late 70s is what fueled the boom. So I was, and all of us at Ironman, we had the wind at our back, just the opposite of when we closed the business. We had a tidal wave in front of us, which was the internet. But as I said, the group of people that I happened upon, we'll call it, I didn't search them out, I happened upon, ended up being a crew that essentially were unchanged for 25 years.
Yeah, that's true. That's from I started in 76, went all the way through 215.
Yeah.
And the magazine that ended its.
Right. Well, we went from 250,000 print run at the top to 25,000 print run at the bottom. We were the first one to have, because of Helen Yu and her expertise in the internet and programming, because of her, we were able to have the first web page of any bodybuilding magazine by far, and by far the first one to put a page-turning regular magazine on the internet. And we were able to do that because of Helen. But I soon found that the internet, which I was hoping, and the iPad, I was hoping both of them would be our salvation. I found that that wasn't so. And the experiment was, we did an issue that was also in print and then also online in a page turning thing, full format, all of the ads were tied to the advertisers' websites, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, the software to do that was $5,000 an issue. And we had to pay for every download to the guy that created the software. So we did one issue and we sold like they downloaded free 38,000 copies. The second issue, we did the same thing and free again. And they downloaded about 42,000 copies. The third issue, I tried to charge 99 cents. We sold 750 copies.
Wow.
So that's where, marketing in our little world here, you got to try it and see if it's going to work, because a focus group isn't going to tell you. So that was $10,000 an issue that we spent to learn that it wasn't going to work. And it didn't work because there was so much free stuff out there. And then this is way before the internet got to where it is today, of course. But the young 14 to 20-year-olds who formed the nucleus of each new wave of bodybuilders disappeared. Our readership got older and older and older. There was nobody under 20 reading magazines. Not just Ironman. This is true of magazines in general and bodybuilding in particular. So that was the beginning. That was the beginning of the end on print media and on Ironman. In between, as you well know, we got involved with the LA FitExpo and created that. And we had, 20 years of the Ironman Pro?
Yeah, 20 consecutive years. 1990 to 2009.
Right.
What lineups that show had, not to mention the greatest lighting of all time. People still talk about that lighting today.
Well, and here's another serendipitous thing. In 1968, I started to promote AAU shows. And I lit the show, like they always lit them, boom, all from the front. And a guy came up to me his name was Al Urban. And I knew he had done studio work. And he said, you should really add some uplights from the bottom because that'll really help to define the physique on the sides. So in 1967, beyond the platform, I added, they actually, believe it or not, they called them Dago lights because they were made in Italy. Dago lights that would shine up from behind. And that was the first time that was used. And again, Al Urban, who the heck is he? But, of course, then doing studio photography for the next 20 years, I learned way more about lighting. And as far as I'm concerned, all of these stage decorations are a waste of money because nobody ever talks about how the stage looks. They only talk about how the bodies look. And that's why those 20 years of Ironman Pro shows, between Mike's backgrounds, creation of the stage, the lighting, they'll stand the test of time. They've become, I look at those shots and I'm going, it looks like studio stuff.
Yeah, you even see the video of the Ironman shows. I even look at it. I was the MC for all 20 years, and even I'm looking at it and going, I didn't realize that I looked that good, but because I viewed it as a spectator with that spectacular lighting.
Well, because you were off to one side on the podium, and you're kind of looking over your shoulder at them. And of course, the video was done by Mike was always taking the pictures out front because I was running the backstage, etc. And early on, I had a studio in the back. I would do both. I tried to do that. It got to be too much. But, then Wayne Gallash, the great cinematographer from Australia that's covered bodybuilding now for 60 years, most of the videos that are there were done by him. We had a couple of people early on. And, of course, this is before you had your phone to do the video. You actually had to have video cameras and setups, but it was high quality stuff.
Yeah, great. And show went 20 years, but at the end, like you say, the numbers started dwindling, and there was no other choice. But at the end of 2009, when we moved down to the LA Convention Center, that was the final show.
Right. The LA Convention Center wasn't any of the wonderful venues we were in, starting with the auditorium in Redondo Beach Performing Arts Auditorium, the perfect setting for bodybuilding. 1,300 seats, beautiful stage, all the lighting you could want, great parking, all of those things. We eventually weren't able to use it because the ballet was in the time slot there, but I didn't want to move the contest because we always used that contest a week or so, maybe 2 weeks at the most, before the Lorimer show, and Jim would always keep at least one invitation open to see who was the outstanding new guy in our event. So historically, many of the people that were in the Ironman went on to go into Jim Lorimer's fantastic shows in Columbus, Ohio.
And won a lot of titles there.
Yeah.
Chris Cormier, Flex Wheeler, Vince Taylor, John Ray.
Yeah, well, it reads like a who's who of bodybuilding of that period, without question. And I look at those lineups, like you say, in the 1990 to 1, 2, 3. Those top 6 guys, we've never seen that quality again.
Yeah, it was amazing who we'd get year after year. Well, let's put it this way. There's one guy who never did win the Ironman. His name was Ronnie Coleman.
That's right. Right. We saw Ronnie before he became Ronnie.
Yeah.
And, but if you look at the number of Mr. Olympias that the Ironman preceded, quite a few, so.
Yeah, I was really disappointed when we had to cut the show loose. Of course, I was looking at my own selfish reason because I loved the contest and loved them seeing it. But financially, I remember you looked out in the audience and down at the convention center, and it was hardly anybody there. We were ready to start the finals, and you basically said this is going to be it.
Yeah, well, California had 2 problems. That's when the Olympia was moved to Las Vegas. And because the Olympia was in Las Vegas, at that point, half the people that went to the Olympia in the fall were from Southern California. So I'm in February with a contest, and they're going like, why should we see that? We've seen all these guys before, and I mean, that was literally it. There was no, putting the Olympia in Las Vegas was the beginning of putting the nail in our coffin as far as a contest is concerned. And the other thing was contracts. I mean, if you look at 1991, 1992, 3 or 4, those were 8 or 10 of the best guys in the world, maybe with only the current Mr. Olympia not part of it. Eventually, because the bodybuilders, were making so much money in their contracts, they didn't have to compete, and they didn't. So every show outside of the Olympia became second rate. Even Jim Lorimer, it was a struggle, and he was giving away 10 times the money we were. But the guys didn't want to get in shape for him.
Yeah, those contracts, I think, really probably contributed more than anything, because they would say, why why enter a contest? I can make more money doing a couple guest posts.
Right. You know, and that's, again, that's a reality. There's nothing we could do about that. And those were the, those were the two main things, as far as I'm concerned, that made the demise of the regional show. I mean, we did it for 20 years. I did the first one in 1980, California Grand Prix. That one I did completely by myself that was crazy, in the Santa Monica Civic. And we had 2,300 people in the Santa Monica Civic.
Wow.
Yeah.
We never had that many at the Ironman.
No, and you never had that many at any show. If you remember, Flex tried to do something there at the Santa Monica.
Yeah, after the Ironman.
And right. And what did it do? Even Flex magazine, with its millions of dollars and its pull on the athletes, it was a mediocre show, and it was maybe 1,000 people in the audience, maybe.
Yeah.
So anyway, the world changes, and you have to adapt to it. And eventually, the adaptation means that you have to give something up, because it's being silly to go forward. It's costing you both money and emotion.
Well, tell us how you got started with the expo. How'd the expo come up?
Well, the expo started with a phone call. I got a phone call from a guy from Creation Entertainment, Aaron Ferries. Had no idea who this was. Okay, he told me what he did, and he had done 2 or 3 years before, he had done an expo with Weider, but they had fallen out. They weren't going to do them anymore. Whatever the fallout was, I won't get into that. But so Aaron starts telling me that he would like to partner with Ironman, and we're going to do something at the LA Convention Center, and this is who we are, and we do hundreds of conventions a year on various things. We've got everything in place to do this. He says, besides, I was vacationing in Florida, and I was talking to this guy, Mark Neveux, and he was interested in bodybuilding like I was, and I was really impressed by this guy, and I'm going, I didn't say anything to him that I had known Mark for 15 years. I listened, and I go like, well, this is a real flyer. We're putting up a lot of Ironman's prestige, etc., on the line here for this kind of event. But with Mark semi in charge of the whole thing, it made my confidence level go from 0 to 90, because Mark is a one of a kind again. Met him. He was at 23. Mark was a controller for the Weider Empire. At 23, Wharton School graduate, a real Wharton School graduate, not the one that got in with a freebie, and friends to this day. So that was how we started, through Aaron Ferris giving me a call, because if the Weider wasn't doing it with him, I was the second choice. Who else was there? Because he needed a magazine, and he needed access to the bodybuilders. So between that and Warren Wanderer, who was selling ads for Ironman, began to sell the booth space, etc., for the expo. As then Mark broke off and started to do that also. So again, serendipitous. If Aaron hadn't fallen out with the Weeders, he never would have called me. If he called me and he didn't mention Mark Neveux, would I have stepped into the abyss? Probably.
Well, how about another guy?
Probably not.
Another guy that stepped in named Russ DeLuca.
You're absolutely right. What a wonderful guy. From bodybuilding.com. And we were the first one at the Santa Monica Civic, as you well know, to stream live bodybuilding. And we only did it because he came up to me and he said, what'll it cost to do this? I go, let me check into it. He says, I said about $15,000, because you didn't have fiber optics. You had T1 lines, which were thousands of dollars to rent, plus all of the other stuff. He said, I said about 15,000. He says, well, let's do it. I mean, literally opened his pocket and took out a check and wrote me a check, because he was a super creative you know, he was a center of bodybuilding.com with his sons. Anyway, terrific guy. Died way too young. Way too young. Wonderful guy.
So we started Ironman, and I think we were the first people to do that.
Yeah.
Now, did that hurt the attendance?
It didn't seem to, but as wonderful as Santa Monica Civic was, I think it's 34 or 500 seats, just a spectacular room. Even when we put 2,000 in it, it felt half empty because it was. And so it was expensive, but a spectacular thing. So we eventually.
John, are you referring to the Pasadena Civic Auditorium?
What did I say? Yeah, Pasadena.
Santa Monica, I think you mean.
No, I meant Pasadena. Excuse me, Pasadena. You're right. So that was a spectacular. We never went back to Santa Monica because that got to be way expensive, crazy. It wasn't possible for that kind of an event. So anyway, that's Santa Monica Civic was our stepping stone where we started our expo, our LA Fitness Expo. We outgrew that in I think 2 years. The expo, we had to move downtown. And there was no theater like the Pasadena Civic that we could rent close to the venue in downtown LA. So we tried to bring it inside, and that it was a flat floor, compromised, and that was also when when the Olympia started to really come into Las Vegas. So it came together, and basically we went from 1,800 people to 750.
That was the beginning.
Yeah,
beginning of it.
But then we started the Ironman naturally, and that we started to do an amateur contest, an NPC sanctioned, polygraph tested contest, and those were a lot of fun because it brought me back kind of to the old days where young bodybuilders look like young bodybuilders, and it was just a certain energy in the room of people doing what they love to do. So that ran for a while until things changed again, and those changes made the expo grow for a while, but we were really, really hurt by, like many events, including Arnold, hit by COVID. COVID was really a serious punch in the face, for all of us.
Well, I'm gonna throw some names out there because you had quite a list of icons that you were close with. I'm gonna throw some names out there. Tell me some stories, starting with John Grimmick.
John Grimmick. Wow. Anyway, John Grimmick was an icon from the late 40s forward. And our second office in Marina Del Rey, out of the blue, John Grimmick and Angela Grimmick walk into the space. And John Grimmick, like very few people, you could tell something changed in the room even if you didn't see it. He was a Jack Nicholson type. When Jack Nicholson walks into the room, you don't need to know. You just know that the room has changed. At the other end, he was like, again, just a lovely guy. His wife was super funny. He's already 80. He's maybe late 70s or 80. But he took me aside and gave me advice on the magazine. We had laughs together. I ended up being friends with him and doing interviews. And I said, John, when did you feel like you were getting old? He goes, and he talked like the guy next door who was a truck driver. He says, well, I was training in the basement on a Saturday by myself, and I was squatting 500. He's 68 years old. I was squatting 500, and I stopped him. I said, isn't that really dangerous? He says, if I get stuck at the bottom, I just push it off me. So he comes upstairs. He goes, I'm taking a shower. And he says, and I get out of the shower, and get my razor out and I'm going to shave. I look in the mirror and I couldn't figure out who it was. I'm looking in the mirror, and for the first time, I realized that I was 68 years old. And that's how he, of course, we all know, the mirror is a terrible thing, Lonnie.
Well, when you shook his hand up, he seemed like he was 28.
Absolutely. And when I said to him, John, you were over 20 years, you were the inspiration for millions of people to start training. He waved it off. I was just there. I was lifting, no ego about it whatsoever.
Reg Park.
I hate to keep repeating the same thing. They don't make them like these guys anymore. Reg Park, I met through Arnold and through his son, John. And of course, very late, he's already in his 60s. But he, again, like Grimmick, talking to you like he knew you forever. And just a warm, wonderful guy. I mean, and I'll tell you, he always sat in the fifth row at the Arnold contest, fifth row center. And I was coming down the aisle when I was taking pictures. I was coming down the aisle to go into the pit. And we had run an article about him, a historical article about him in Ironman a couple of months before. So I hear him stands up and I hear him call out my name. I turn around and I walk over to where I'm like on the edge of the aisle. He says, I just want to thank you for that article. I'm going like, what? That's the kind of guy he was. I mean, this is an icon. I'm just a guy running a magazine. He takes the time to thank me for an article that I barely remember doing. It wasn't a favor for him. It was a favor for our readership. That's him.
Armand Tanny.
Well, now you're talking about somebody who was an original Muscle Beach guy. A guy that in 1948, as 198, could clean and jerk 360. This was one of the stalwarts of Muscle Beach. I didn't, of course, know him at that period, but because he wrote for Weider and he and I would cover contests in Europe, I spent a lot of time with him. Great stories, great integrity. Just a guy that you're very comfortable with. Had all kinds of great historical stuff, but a real pioneer again. Just go ahead. Robert Blake.
Loretta himself.
Robert Blake. Vince Gironda. And I'm going to give you a Vince Gironda story that's tied to Robert Blake that Robert told me himself. And Robert first, he calls me at the office. I hadn't seen him in 35 years. I saw him, but never really knew him at Vince's in the 60s. He says, I pick up the phone. He says, this is Robert Blake. In True Blood, in Cold Blood, I'm going like, I recognize your voice. He says, you got a picture that you took from Vince's wall when he closed the gym that I'd like to buy. So he tells me about it. When Vince closed the gym, his gym on 3 walls had framed pictures of all kinds of great bodybuilders of time. And when Vince closed his gym, I bought all of those photos off the wall from Vince. And I says, well, what? He says, you got that one with Vince and this woman and et cetera, by the swimming pool? And I said, yeah, I actually have 2 copies of that. So he drives up from the valley up to Oxnard. And he's sitting at the conference table. And I'm saying, why this girl? He goes like, she was my first true love in high school. That was what he told me. And then he told me the Vince Gironda story. I says, what did you really think of Vince? He says, well, let me tell you one story. He says, in the early 60s, I was an actor, and I punched the wrong guy in the face. I didn't work for 4 years. I lived upstairs from the gym in that unused apartment. Vince never charged me a nickel. That's Vince Gironda.
Wow. Franco Colombo.
strongest man I've ever seen, and probably the strongest man, pound for pound, in the world. Just, the kind of weights he used. A 700-pound deadlift for reps without straps. He had hands like talons, I used to say, and that was part of it. But I'll tell you one little story. The original Gold's Gym, when you went out the back door, you were in an alley, and there were three little parking spots there. Franco put his bag down right in the doorway and came back into the gym because he forgot something. And all of a sudden, at the corner of his eye, he sees one of the 12-year-old kids in the neighborhood snatch his bag and start off down the alley. He runs to the door and he says, "Stop, or I'm going to run over your head," in his accent, of course, which I'm not going to do. The kid stopped in mid-stride. Franco comes up to him, pulls him by his traps, pinch grip, into the gym. Bag is here. He's in the gym with this kid. The kid shaking like a leaf. He says, "That was a wrong thing to do, and you have to promise me that you're never going to do anything like that again." And the kid, of course, agrees, because I'm waiting for him to be violent in some ways, but that's all he did. Didn't do anything to the kid, told him to be a good kid. The kid walks out. That's one side of Franco, the other side of his strength. And he was, as I said, nobody to this day, there isn't anybody at 180 pounds that deadlifts 700 without straps. 700, period.
Boyer Co.
Boyer Co. Met Boyer Co. in 1969. I put together a party. Boyer was going to pose in Southern California at a contest, at an AAU contest for the first time. There was nobody has ever seen him on the West Coast. So I talked to a couple of people I know, and the picture is kind of legendary today. Everybody who was there, from Arnold and Franco and Frank Zane, and there were 30 bodybuilders in the room for this party that was held in a sound stage. Arte Zeller actually took the photo. And that's when I met him. From there, I went to New Orleans, to Metairie, where he was living, and I photographed him there on piers and outside. And that became, again, a friendship that I've talked to him in the last 6 months. So that was, he was, again, just a real Southern gentleman, soft-spoken, another terrific guy.
Tell us about how did the breakfast start at Muscle Beach?
Muscle Beach breakfast. Well, that was an idea. I wanted to get, as you know, Joe Wheatley was putting together really wonderful events and honoring people at the beach with Lifetime Achievement Awards and with and awards for other things. So we still had a group of bodybuilders from Jim Morris and down that, quote, were alive and available. So I had the idea of getting everybody together before, because a lot of people went, before the event at the beach itself. So I literally called and got people and told them what I was going to do and come down. I said, the breakfast is on me, and let's get together and talk about friendship. And as you well know, that kind of grew into something that was truly special because of the people that showed up. And you were there. I mean, it was 2-3 hours of fun.
Especially because of breakfast. So was the parking. Thanks.
Well, I picked up the parking too. But anyway, it was, you name some of the people who were there, Lonnie. Go down your list.
Most of the people that you mentioned, Ruth was there, Steve was there. I believe Jerry Branham was there. Doug Brignoli was there.
Right.
Mike Glass.
Anita Tenorino.
Yes.
Anyway, there was a lot. It was a lot of fun, and that group of people is when I look at the pictures. When I look at the pictures, there's no longer. They're no longer here. So it's a kind of a nostalgic look. But again, you and I were fortunate enough to be in a place that was going to go on forever in our minds, but didn't. But we definitely were there in the golden age. You got to hold on a second.
Well, you gave away awards at the Ironman. Perry and Mabel Rader Lifetime Achievement Award, Art Zeller Photography, Vince Gironda. And not only that, but you got one yourself in 2014, Lifetime Achievement Award at the Arnold Classic in Columbus.
Well, again, knowing Arnold from the beginning and what we've done together over time, that was maybe I'm going to call it the greatest honor of my life in bodybuilding. So, 2014, you're going to have to hold a second. My dog's barking.
Let's interview the dog.
Wait a minute.
See how the dog in Florida. We're probably going to have to wrap this up pretty soon and come back for a second interview because there's so many amazing things about this guy. I could be on here for 4 or 5 hours. I don't think you have that time. Either do I, actually. But I did say I was going to bring the story behind the story, and I can see that there's a lot of things about John that I don't even know until today, and I worked for him for 30 years.
Well,
so who let the dog?
Well, as you know, remember we have Vizslas, and the Vizsla dog, that breed, is very, very social. Wherever I am, she wants to be at my feet. And I closed my office door here, so she was just sitting outside crying and barking because she wanted to be with me. So anyway, I put her in the other room, and we can go on. Sorry for the interruption.
Okay, well, we were just talking about the award in Columbus.
Yeah, what it did, besides the wonderful award sitting right up on my cabinet here on the right, was it forced me to kind of look back on my life in a chronological way because I was going to present, 99% of the people in the room didn't really know who I am or where I came from. So I wanted to give them a quick synopsis of, my own start in the bodybuilding. And that is, it forced me to look back and do a chronological, something that I had never done. And that, of course, then highlighted in my own mind, it made it very clear that there were so many people that were special that I was fortunate enough to know.
Yeah, that was quite a night. I was the MC of that, and it was quite an honor for me to bring you on stage for you to win that prestigious award.
Well, it was absolutely wonderful, and I'll tell you one little funny thing about it because I'm just bringing up the thank you speech I did, and Arnold's handing me the thing, and I'm going to the podium and I have 3x5 cards with my notes on it. He goes, "Oh my God!" He says, "Somebody actually prepared themselves." And this was my opening line. "This building and many of the people in it hold a lifetime of memories for me. I first walked in 1967 with my friend Bob Weider, the 1966 Mr. America. That was the first time that I didn't know Jim Lorimer at that point, but that was the first time I was in the Veterans Memorial Auditorium in Columbus, Ohio. And that building was 4,400 people, as you well know, and maybe the greatest bodybuilding events and in a theater of all time.
It was amazing. Let's fast forward. When did you decide to move forward?
Well, we came, as you probably know, Justin graduated from University of Miami, and Lily graduated from the University of Miami as a lawyer. They both ended up marrying Floridians. And we came out and visited, and I'm going like, I'm really, 6-hour plane rides are getting to be much less fun than they used to be. And so we looked at, what we could do to move out here. And that was basically it. Stephanie and I have 2 children, plus now 2 grandchildren. This morning, I worked out with Justin in his home gym at 7 o'clock. So I see him 4 days a week, and my granddaughter and his wife. So as I said to somebody the other day, being able to work out with my son, who I hadn't trained with since he was 18, he's 37, every day, every day.
Justin's 37? No.
Yeah, I know, Lonnie. It is. It's crazy. I still remember him as a little boy. But anyway, those are the things. I mean, on Sunday, Lily and her husband and her daughter and Justin and his wife and daughter are going to be here. I cook dinner. I cook a late lunch for them every other Sunday. So we get together and use some of my mother's old Italian recipes and make food for them, and the 2 girls then get to play with each other, Eliana and Cambry, and they're like 6 months or 7 months apart. So it's wild. I mean, in other words, I don't remember Justin and Lily at this stage and how they were and the transition, but kids at this age, every time you see them, they're new. They're just evolving so fast. Anyway, that's the reason we did it. We did it to be close to them. Florida is a totally different animal than California. It is on my scale of 1 to 10, it's a 2, and California's a 10. But that's me. But I don't miss it.
Bodybuilding much these days?
I don't follow it almost at all. When they took posing out and they made size first, muscularity second, and proportion third in the judging, those 2 things completely opened the door for where we're at today. And then, like Mike Neveux said, if they would have rewarded a 200-pound, beautifully proportioned physique with the Olympia, that would have been the standard. It didn't have to get bigger. It's just they became who the bodybuilders became who the judges' idea of the winner. In other words, the bodybuilder doesn't. The judges are who creates the show. Dorian Yates didn't win on his own. He only won because the judges chose him.
Right.
And that's nothing against Dorian. I love the guy, but I mean, you have to put what's due is due. I mean, to me, the last great, Mr. Olympia was probably Lee Haney. Little bitty waist. He was like a big Steve Reeves. And it was still How
about Steve Reeves? Any memories of Steve Reeves?
I didn't meet Steve until 1980 when I did my California Grand Prix. Steve Reeves, I had him there as a special guest. That was the first time I met him. And I met him through Russ Warner. And Russ, of course, knew him from 1946 or 8, So he wanted $1,000 to show up, 1980. And I went to subsequent parties in Southern California where he was there. Another just charismatic guy. Jeez. Eventually passed away way too young. Went into a hospital for something minor and got sick and died in the hospital. But he was I'll tell you one thing. I went to the wake with Joe Weider, the remembrance, I guess you call it. And Joe Weider was just broken. I mean, the big thing was, he basically said it to me. He said, how could somebody this perfect die? It just brought mortality into focus for him that even Steve Reeves could pass. it was like he just couldn't metabolize it. Eventually he did, of course, but I mean, in the shock, that was his answer to me, and it was a good one for me too. You know, I understood that in a very graphic way that this doesn't go on forever.
Well, and this interview is going on forever. So I think it's time that we stop right now. But we'd like to bring you back for another session, John, because you've done way too much for me to just get it all in an hour and a half. So is it okay if we bring you back?
Absolutely. Always fun, Lonnie. You do a great job too.
Thank
Wonderful.
you very much.
Okay.
That's another edition of Going Deeper with Teper, knowing there's more stories what appears up front. It's the stories behind the stories. Over, under, we're out.
Take care. Bye-bye.